Okay. Yes, so I formerly worked at SANBI, and I will be presenting this talk on behalf of SANBI, specifically looking at wildlife biodiversity conservation in South Africa. So biodiversity loss continues to be an increasing concern to conservationists, governments, society, as well as policymakers. And it's very important to note that biodiversity encompasses variability among living organisms from all sources. So that includes terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems. And biodiversity incorporates diversity at the genetic level, at the species level, as well as the ecosystem level. So you can't just look at a species and look at their diversity and say that represents the biodiversity of the ecosystem. You have to look at three different levels. So there are two important international organizations that are looking at biodiversity globally. So the first key organization is your IUCN, and their core mission is to influence, encourage, and assist societies throughout the world to conserve the integrity and diversity of nature and to ensure that any use of natural resources is equitable as well as sustainable. A second very important organization is the CBD, or Convention on Biological Diversity, and that entered into force in 1993. And the CBD has three main objectives: the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of its components, as well as the fair and equitable share of benefits arising from genetic resources. And they developed two important agreements that has specific importance to South Africa. The first one is the Protocol on Biosafety, which regulates the movement of living modified organisms resulting from current biotechnology between countries, as well as the Ngoya Protocol, which was adopted in 2014. And that makes sure that there's a legal framework so that there's a fair and equitable share of benefits originating from the use of biodiversity. So South Africa has signed to the CBD on the 4th of June 1993, and it has been a member state to this convention since November 1995, which means that we have some responsibilities to the CPD. So to give this effect to its commitments, government has developed NEMBA, which is the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act of 2004, which was put in place to safeguard South Africa's important biodiversity attributes by ensuring its protection and sustainable use. So there are two very important documents. So we have the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So this is a requirement of the CBD, and it gives the national strategy for the conservation of South Africa's biodiversity and outlines how South Africa is going to fulfill its objectives to the CBD and contribute to the global sustainable development agenda. A second important document is your National Biodiversity Framework. It was also developed as a requirement of NEMBA, and it is to coordinate as well as align the efforts of many organizations and individuals involved in conserving and managing South Africa's biodiversity. So these two documents, which are commitments under the CBD, they are informed by the National Biodiversity Assessment. So the National Biodiversity Assessment, it provides a science that informs these documents, and it's led by SANBI in partnership with several other organizations. So the last NBA was published in 2018, and it specifically addressed two goals of the CBD, which was to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity, as well as improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. The National Biodiversity Assessment consisted of 7 technical reports, one for each realm. So that's your terrestrial, your aquatic, your estuarine, and your marine, as well as 2 technical reports which were cross-realm. So that's the coast and South Africa's sub-Antarctic territory. And there was also a technical report on genetic diversity. And as you can see, this NBA informs several targets, including governments as well as the CBD. However, even though there's been an increase in these policies and actions to support biodiversity, we've seen that biodiversity continues to decline. So between 2011 and 2020, we've seen that there is a worsening of biodiversity. And at a global level, none of the targets set out by the CPD in 2010 were achieved. And if we look at the IUCN Red List, we have found that there's over 1 million species that are still currently threatened with extinction. So to kind of address this, they have developed the 2030 mission, which is to take urgent action across society to put biodiversity on the path to recovery for the benefit of the planet and the people. So we have targets in 2030, and that is then to hopefully by 2050 have that biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used. So there are many targets for 2030 that are under 3 different areas. The first, reducing threats to biodiversity. The second is meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. So even though we have to reduce the threats to biodiversity, we still have to take into account the needs of human beings. Then the third section is tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these global targets. So the first is to halt species extinction by protecting genetic diversity as well as managing human-wildlife conflict, ensuring sustainable, safe, and legal harvesting and trade of wild species, and minimizing the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and building resilience. Under tools and solutions, they have that they want to mobilize about $200 billion per year for biodiversity from all sources, strengthen capacity building, technology transfer, and scientific and technical cooperation for biodiversity, and ensure that knowledge is available and accessible to guide biodiversity actions. So what are the challenges in wildlife biodiversity conservation in South Africa? So I'm going to go through a couple of challenges, and these are not just pertinent to SANBI, they're pertinent to the whole sector of wildlife biodiversity conservation. So the first important challenge is that we have to ensure that scientists involved in this research are equipped with the most innovative technologies and are trained in these areas. So examples of new innovative technologies in the field of biodiversity conservation is, for example, eDNA, and that is where you can go and collect samples, say, from a lake, and you're able to catalog the DNA of every species in that area. Other examples of innovative technologies include network sensors, where you can track animals' movement and behavior, artificial intelligence that we've just spoke about in the previous talk, and that could be used, for example, in facial recognition of animals. And then, of course, we have genomics, where studies have gone from looking at just a small portion of the DNA of a species or population and has moved now to looking at the entire genome of an animal or population. So some of the challenges is that the researchers that are working in this field must be equipped with skills and knowledge You would also generally need cutting edge equipment. However, this requires dedicated funding to obtain this equipment as well as to maintain it. It is very important that when you're using these innovative technologies, that you carefully consider which species and habitat requires monitoring, because obviously there's not funding to look at everything. You have to look at the things that need the most urgent help. And then, of course, the need to address issues of data security. So obviously, if you're tracking animal movements, and recognizing animals, you're going to have to keep this data secure so that people that are involved, for example, in poaching, do not have access to this data, which could not be a good thing. So some of the opportunities or success stories that we have is we have the African Biogenome Project, that is looking at next generation sequencing, and they are able to generate, analyze, and look at several species by looking at the entire genomes. We also have Diplomics, which is high performance labs and platforms through a virtual network, which provides high class genomics, proteomics, and bioinformatics services. Another challenge in wildlife biodiversity conservation in South Africa is that we have to include communities in our research. So this is kind of a new thing, and you can see it with the funding grants that they now want this component included into funding. However, it is difficult for scientists because it's kind of a new thing that we have to do. So we don't have the training or knowledge of how to communicate with communities. So there's a general lack of involvement of the general public in research, and engagement with local communities is often limited. Another problem that researchers face is how do we communicate our science to the public in a way that the public can understand? Connected to this is we need to invest in education programs at schools as well as universities for understanding and awareness of biodiversity decline and its consequences. So some of our success stories is, for example, at SANBI, we have citizen science initiatives through iNaturalist as well as virtual museum projects. And about 72% of South Africans use medicinal plants on a regular basis. And that puts ongoing pressure on plants in the wild. And in response to this, SANBI, in partnership with the ARC, are developing a project where they are cultivating some of these medicinal plants in all of the botanical gardens of SANBI, which is found in all the provinces of South Africa. In connection with this, we are also supporting traditional healers where they are able to grow and cultivate their own medicinal plants in hopefully areas of occupancy. And we've seen, for example, in Mpumalanga, traditional healers are already cultivating and rewilding wild ginger. And now we are supporting them on other species. And this will ensure sustainable use of medicinal plants in medicine. Another challenge is that we have to ensure that we have a multidisciplinary collaborative network. So it's no longer that we can just look at the genetics of an animal and provide information on diversity and have that as an indicator of the health of the ecosystem. We have to have scientists from all different fields, so from biology to informatics, modeling, climatology, hydrology, all working together to kind of analyze complex systems. So the challenge is that we have to have networks and training programs that bring people together from all of these different disciplines, as well as include stakeholders and policymakers who are then going to use that information on the ground. So you need these inter-university and organization networks, and that would make sure that the research infrastructure is effective as well as efficient. In connection with that, you also need single repositories of data, as well as unified data collection approaches. So if you have different organizations collecting data, if they're collecting the same type of data in the same way, that can then be put together to analyze biodiversity. So some of our success stories is we do have the South African Research Infrastructure Roadmap, and that is providing strategic, rational, medium and long-term planning or provision of research infrastructure, and that ensures that South Africa is competitive on an international level. It comprises of a network of 16 institutions, including museums, science councils, and 3 universities. And it's focused on biobanks. So this is the preservation and collection of plants, animals, fossils, and fungi. Another challenge is that we have to invest strongly in enhancing fundamental knowledge on biodiversity drivers and threats. So the challenges in this area is that we need an ambitious research agenda where we're able to identify knowledge gaps. The scientific knowledge needs to be incorporated into biodiversity practice, and for that we need dedicated funding not only for basic research, but as well as for long-term monitoring of biodiversity. One of our mechanisms that we can have this ambitious research agenda is the National Biodiversity Assessment, the next one which will be published in 2025. And in this way, researchers will not only focus on, say, their pet projects, but they'll able to focus on directed research that responds to country priorities using the right indicators. So an example of this is that in the next NBA, we'll include looking at barcoding, where we look at a small piece of the animal's DNA, which enables us to identify the species as well as to look at the taxonomy of the species. Another challenge is that we have to leverage funding for biodiversity conservation. So usually funding sources or lack of funding is a critical obstacle in research. And we have to diversify our funding sources in order to address this. So we need to identify all financing partners as well as form strategic partnerships. We need to identify ways to diversify our funding sources, for example, looking at private finances. And we need support, or researchers need support, in order to develop those grant proposals for international funding. However, because we are going to have this ambitious research agenda, this will enable us to identify as well as map opportunities for biodiversity conservation research. So investors as well as government will be able to identify as well as prioritize investments. So what are some of the takeaways of this presentation? The first is that biodiversity loss is a risk for the environment and for humanity. As a planet, we are failing to meet all the targets set to slow down biodiversity destruction by 2020. And this is especially important for South Africa because South Africa is home to 10% of the world's plant species, 7% of reptiles, birds, and mammals, and 15% of the world's marine species. And because South Africa has commitments under the CBD to reduce threats to biodiversity, we have to use effective and advanced tools while still meeting people's needs. So though there are several challenges, a unified approach using innovative technologies across universities and organizations that leverages available national and international funds can contribute to the global biodiversity targets set out by IUCN and the CBD. Thank you.